Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which is wrapped in multiple layers of turbulence, of change, that's for sure, and noise. Sustainability itself has no meaning, so I ask sustain what every day is in my journalism process. And that's what this webcast is about. It's using questions and conversation to seek a little bit of clarity and pathways toward progress. And as I posted this morning on my blog, you can't have environmental progress if we have an information environment that's polluted and full of questions and assertions, but not bedrock. So that's why I occasionally write about things like UFOs and in this case, mass sightings of what people are reporting as drones, concentrated over New Jersey, but it's spilled down as far as Miami, where someone posted some weird angled imagery of the Goodyear blimp, and it looked like an alien rocket ship, and people were starting to say, the Goodyear blimp's Twitter account corrected that person, which was pretty interesting. So it's a mess out there. And Joanna Berger, who's in New Jersey, is a Rutgers biologist, a distinguished professor on the faculty at Rutgers. At the very last second, through Carl Safina, a longtime friend of mine, has joined us because she's had some direct experience with what we're talking about. I'm in Maine. I don't think we've had any reports that I know of here. And my main guest today is Robert Bartholomew, who has made a long career in sociology, in kind of medical sociology, looking at behavior, especially at the scale of populations, and how we, the human species, sometimes gets caught up in things that, as you can see from his many books, with another one coming out, there are delusions that can spread, there are manias that can spread. And then there also is reality out there, as we're going to talk about with Joanna. So, and you're down in New Zealand, but obviously keeping track of things globally. I saw the Psychology Today story you wrote that kind of gets at this. So let's just dive right in, and I'd like to start with, if you don't mind, with the direct report from the field in the New Jersey area. Do you live in New Jersey, or are you across the border in Pennsylvania? Where are you?
Me?
Yeah, Joanna, sorry.
Oh, no, I live in New Jersey. I live in Somerset. We're between Easton Avenue and 287 for people who know New Jersey. That's where Rutgers is, sort of where the Raritan River is. And I was not necessarily a believer. I thought that people were seeing airplanes that might be lower or helicopters or something like that. So I started out not believing that this could be the case. And last Thursday night, the 12th of December, my husband and I were in our hot tub, as we often go in before we go to bed at night. And it was later than we usually go in. We usually go in much earlier. And so our heads were sort of not much above the ground, covered in water. And at 11:52, and I know because I have a clock that I can see from the hot tub, so I know that I'm not in there too long. And this thing came across at tree height, at our tree height, between two breaks in the trees in our backyard, not more than maybe 40 feet away from us, and at the tree height, and it came chugging along, giving both a kind of roar, but also a high-pitched whirl that was sort of like an air conditioner or something, but was quite high pitched. My husband, I don't think, could hear that. I think he just heard the boom. And it came chugging right across the yard to the other side, going through an opening at the tops of the trees on the other side of the yard, having lost a little bit of altitude. It basically was the size of a four-wheeler. At the same time, there are plane routes that we can see at quite a distance from where we are in the hot tub, and we could see planes going by at a high. This was not in the plane route. Right. It was the size of sort of a four-wheeler, one of those things that
like off-road.
Yeah, that my father used to drive around the farm when I was a kid.
Right.
and it had blue lights and white lights and one green light blinking. It moved at a steady speed. It seemed when it went by us that made it more of a roar, but that's hard to tell because it went by. But it was some, because we have the trees and we can actually see where it would have come through. It was a little off-putting and disturbing, but it was clearly not an airplane. There were no wings. It was square. It was oblong. You could, I mean, if it had any kind of whirling thing, we couldn't have seen it anyway.
Right.
The lights were blinking, and I was really shocked by this. But I have had 3 other friends who, at different places in the neighborhood, I've seen them anywhere from dusk to dawn. Reliable people who are bird watchers and used to looking at detail. Ours moved right straight across, but one of my girlfriends who saw one over her house, it actually stopped and hovered and then went on. So they seem to be doing different things. But I've had 3 friends with firsthand accounts
Right.
that have seen similar things.
So before we go on with Robert and a deeper look at the range of things that are possible in this kind of situation, have you tracked the other reports? Do you have a sense that 2 things can be true, that a lot of people are seeing spurious stuff, and yet there's something real as well?
I think that that's exactly what's going on. There are things that I've seen at greater distances that, since this time, I could imagine that if people saw that, they might say that that's what it was. It was one of those drones. But this was very close and very loud, and I'm a biologist. I'm a field biologist. I spend my life observing birds. I'm used to looking at things in the sky. I made notes about how it was flying, where it was flying through, the distance to the trees. I know how long my yard is, and other people whom I know have seen them have actually seen them. But there are a lot of planes flying around that one could easily mistake.
Right.
But it's not easy to mistake. So, I had the feeling that if I was a strong pitcher, I could have thrown a ball and hit it. Now I'm not, so I couldn't. But it was closer. I mean, it was really close. And so I am in the other. One of the other people is another professor at school who is a psychologist, actually, and who himself saw some. So I think that both things are going on. Once people say they've seen something, people look for them, and there are low-flying planes. But around here, low-flying private planes can't fly over residential areas with houses this close.
Sure.
And they never fly at 11:52 at night.
Right.
In fact, planes are supposed to be in Newark,
Right. This is super interesting. So, Robert, tell us your journey. Well, back away from the specifics of New Jersey. Oh, is that your husband?
Yes.
Well, maybe we can hear from him too. Hey, let's just hear a little initially from Robert. I want to get your trajectory as a sociologist. What led you into this particular arena, and when you think about the history of what you've looked at, how do you make those determinations about what's the line between delusion and the various levels of what a mass of people can do and reality?
Well, when you talk about social delusions, most people are not mentally disturbed who are involved in a social delusion. It's not in the psychiatric sense. We're talking about social delusions, the rapid spread of false beliefs in a particular population. Now, the sighting that was just described, I think, is a drone, right? And there are drones out there, and people have been flying drones. And I think once this began in the media, you have people with drones who are deliberately flying them around as well to get excitement from this. But there's obviously a physical aspect to this. There are drones that are being spotted out there, without a doubt, and they're drones. At the same time, there are a number of, from the pictures that I've seen, clear misidentifications of small aircraft as well. So I've always been interested in unexplained phenomena, UFOs, ghosts, Bigfoot, fairies, near-death experiences, you name it. And when I was younger, I believed in all of it. And then something happened when I went to university. It's called science. And that really changed my perspective. And now I'm a sympathetic skeptic. Just as an aside, my brother, who lives in our hometown of Whitehall, New York, on the base of Lake Champlain, the home of the Lake Champlain monster, my brother is a Bigfoot researcher. And we have some interesting table discussions around that topic. But
Yeah.
I'm a sympathetic skeptic. I want to believe, but throughout the entire history of the world, there's no fossils, no body, no DNA, no physical evidence of Bigfoot. And yet there are millions of hunters in the woods every year, well armed, and no one has been able to come across a body and dragged it back so we can look at it. So I am a sympathetic skeptic. I did at university, when I went to the State University of New York at Albany, I did a master's thesis comparing UFO lore with fairy lore, particularly close encounter reports. And I did a second master's thesis that looked at the history of UFO sighting waves over time. Then I went on to do a PhD on the history of psychiatry, something completely different. So that's a bit of my journey. I've written a number of books, all sympathetically skeptical. I don't believe that space aliens are abducting people. I don't believe that Bigfoot is roaming the woods. I believe the answer to these phenomena will be found not by looking to the skies or searching the woods for evidence of Bigfoot or extraterrestrials or otherworldly beings, but by looking inward to the human mind and at what deep-seated psychological needs are being fulfilled. And the other point is, it's very important, and that is human perception is very fallible and subject to error. And all you have to do is watch an NFL game every week, and there are fumbles that weren't fumbles, that these referees who are trained observers, they know the rules, they have excellent eyesight, and they get it wrong, and they're standing right there. And so it's important to be informed.
I'm going to disagree with you. There's a big difference between believing in Bigfoot, for which there's no evidence, and seeing a drone go over your property where you can actually see it, and there are drones, and you can hear it, and you can see it, and you're not the only person who sees it or has seen it. It's very different from somebody looking for Bigfoot, for which there is no evidence.
Yeah, look, I don't disagree with you. That's your point's well taken. However, I guess my point is a number of the drone sightings, not yours clearly. I think yours is clearly a drone. But a number of the drone sightings that I've seen that have been claimed as drones were clearly small aircraft. And so that is noise that gets mixed up into this. And then, people talk about some ship off the coast, and it's the Iranians, and it's and then space aliens or something like that, and then it goes off the deep end, doesn't it? And then, but you are on one end of the spectrum. You're on the end of the spectrum where that's clearly a sighting of a drone, and you're not mistaken.
See, the problem is that you can't. I mean, I don't usually take a camera out into the hot tub. Now I am now taking one because
Sure.
I want to get again, but it wasn't then, but it was very real. Mike, do you want to say something?
No, I'm listening, and I missed obviously the first and crucial part.
Oh, well, we'll circle back to your wife, Joanna Berger, did lay out all the details about what you saw in your yard, which was, as Robert also says, clearly compelling and concrete, and a scientific observation by by both of you who have a scientific background. And Robert, just to recap, Robert was explaining how these kinds of phenomena can snowball, as even before the ages of social media and like. And Robert, I want to get to some of those old examples that were in your Psychology Today thing. But what I'd like to do right now, just for this is a 2-minute video that Mick West is a guy I've gotten to know who is very adept at technical analysis of visuals related to UFOs and the like, but he's also been involved very much in social media the last couple of days. So this is literally not even, it's like 2 minutes, and maybe we'll just watch this briefly because it lays out some of the technical differences between what Joanna was describing and what is a lot of out there in the Gestalt. Hold on a
They
second.
fly in the sky, sometimes at night, sometimes they fly over military bases, and sometimes people get arrested for doing that. There are small drones and big drones. But there's no good evidence that any of the recent spate of large drone sightings in New Jersey are actually large drones. With practice, you can identify lots of things in the sky. Sometimes you use the shape of the object or its lighting configuration. Sometimes you use a site like Flight Radar 24 or ADS-B Exchange to see what aircraft are in that location or in that direction. Sometimes you look at what stars and planets are in the sky, and sometimes you look up satellites. Most of these need the date, time, location, and the direction the camera is looking in. Date, time, and location are the most important, and I often refer to these as the details, DTLs. In every single case where we have the details, and in many cases where we do not, we managed to identify what was being looked at. In every case, it wasn't a large drone. This triangle drone was a C-130. This video of 8 circling drones was a bunch of planes circling in a holding pattern. This drone was a helicopter. This video of a mystery drone shot by a professional photographer was probably Venus out of focus. Those reports from pilots to air traffic control over Oregon were Starlink satellites. New Jersey Senator Andy Kim saw a lot of drones, but he was looking at planes, something he later discovered. Former Governor Larry Hogan saw drones, but he was looking at stars and planes. These stationary drones over the Capitol were just normal incoming air traffic far away, so seeming not to move much, but they did move. A reporter claimed to see drones, but he shows video of what were obviously planes. I could go on, but the point is made.
My obvious
Every
plan.
case where there's enough information, and especially with the details, the date, the time, and the location, what we see are not drones. If that reporter gave the details, we could see what aircraft he was looking at. The government is slow, and the military is both slow and cautious, but they've all started to come around, with the DHS and the FBI saying on December the 12th, "We have no evidence at this time that the reported drone sightings pose a national security or public safety threat or have a foreign nexus." Upon review of available imagery, it appears that many of the reported sightings are actually manned aircraft operating lawfully. There are no reported or confirmed drone sightings in any restricted airspace. Is it just mass hysteria, social contagion, a collective delusion? Mostly yes. Remember, there's zero evidence of any large drones in New Jersey, and dozens of confirmed misidentifications. Drones are a real thing, and they represent real security concerns. China is probably using them to spy on us. But what we are seeing here is really just a really large flap, just with drones instead of UFOs.
Sorry, let me. So obviously he's making the case. It would be great to get him because you have the data, you have the time and the place,
Oops.
and so you could even he could do a little cross-referencing on whether there was any aviation that might be relevant. So it's kind of interesting, but that's kind of the case, sort of the technical case. Now we can get back to what you guys saw, and then. Also, again, I want to talk to Robert here about the history. So, Robert, we'll get. What's your husband's name, Joanna?
Michael Gushfeld.
Michael, it's good to meet you too. What's your were you at Rutgers also?
Yes,
And what's your specialty, or what was your?
I do environmental toxicology.
Great. So another quantitative scientist, and did you have any other observations you wanted to add about what you saw that night?
No, that's fine.
Okay.
What I saw was, I mean, first of all, it was a shock to see something coming low and fast, where nothing like that had happened before. And we're out there almost every night since 2006.
Right.
We, I didn't get the same color. I'm not, my perception wasn't as sharp and detailed, but I was probably just as surprised. And
And the proximity was clear. It was something
I'm
that was
sorry.
not. The proximity to you was
Yeah,
clear.
it was much too close for something like that. And the yes, well, we never had anything like that, and it was, if we had had more time to think of it, it would have been frightening while we were still there. But to be frightening was after it was out of sight, and you wanted to
Right.
come back so we can get another look. I don't think so. It was clearly something we hadn't seen there before. And we agree on the flight path pretty much, how high it was.
hmm
Yeah.
I may have to see if I can connect you with Mick West. Maybe he can do a little bit of a forensic kind of a
Okay.
backtracking on it, because it does sound like a highly credible case.
Well, I will grant you that it is possible that someone. I didn't think that a drone that size, that the public could have, that it would have to be somebody with some kind of license or experience, because I have some experience with using drones in biology and in tracking habitat and birds and situations. And we had to have incredible licenses and permits and things like that.
Right.
So this was a big enough size that surprised me. And I've heard drones because, as I say, my students have used them in research for their degrees. And it clearly was not an airplane. I mean, at that distance, we couldn't have mistaken it. But it is possible that once this started, nefarious people have decided to fly things that they shouldn't. I mean, I don't know how we're going to ever figure that out, but that's certainly possible. But this was not a low-flying airplane. It would not be. I mean, it would not be possible to be that close and not see it with wings and so on.
Well, there we go. So we're going to circle back to that experience, and if you can hang in there a little bit, let's go through a little bit of history. Robert, again, you did a post for your. I really like your Psychology Today column, which is all on. It's the name of the blog is "It's Catching," and it's about ideas that catch hold, right? Ideas and perceptions.
Yeah, and
So,
if I could just reiterate, I believe the good professor there in Rutgers. I'm sure that she saw a drone. It pretty straightforward there. It's a drone. That's my assessment.
That sounds very compelling too, and I think, again, with the time and place, it's possible to do some cross-checking or whether there was something there that was authorized or unauthorized, or checking power lines, but it wouldn't have been in the evening. So we'll see. That's kind of
Well,
and part of what's going on now with social media and stuff, there's so much misinformation out there, and there's so little critical thinking that many people have stopped searching for information.
right.
And instead they're searching for confirmation and affirmation of pre-existing beliefs, and they just see what they want to see in the media and they read into what they want to believe. And with so many, there's always objects in the sky out there, right? Whether it's Venus or airplanes or drones. And what's the old saying with Shakespeare? Or in the night, imagining some fear, suppose it a bear. Again, not with the Rutgers University professor sighting, but with a lot of this other phenomena that goes on, and when these UFO waves occur.
Right. So take us back through a little history lesson here. One thing that came up recently with the flurry out of New Jersey, of course, is the War of the Worlds broadcast in the late 1930s. Orson Welles. There was a bit of a stir over that, but it turned out that wasn't quite the hysterical example that people have described. There's a journalism professor who sort of deconstructed that. But you went back to the early 20th century, around World War I. What was going on at that time?
Well, could I just make a point that
Totally.
I wrote an entire book on War of the Worlds scares and panics. And the one in 1938, which incidentally was over New Jersey and southern New York, reportedly, right? I mean, that's the report from the Orson Welles broadcast, which started at about 8 o'clock in the studios of WABC in New York City. And for a few minutes at least, there were a number of people, it's estimated over 1 million, who were frightened by that, but did not panic. Like most people didn't get in their cars and rush away or things like that. But certainly when you look at police reports and police blotters from the time, they were inundated with phone calls and there was concern. Now, I know people have come out and said, oh, it was all overhyped to a certain extent because newspapers were concerned about radio at the time as a competitor. And they did, I think, hype the response. However, there was a response. There's no question about that when you look at the police reports. And what's really interesting is many people, well, some people, called into police and actually described what they were hearing on the radio. On the radio, they talked about these Martians on these giant tripods firing heat rays. People actually phoned police and said they could feel the heat. Other people said the poison gas. Others called in and thought they could see the Martian machines in the distance. So there was a response. It's certainly massive, but a number of people were frightened or concerned, particularly around the epicenter, which was Grover's Mill, New Jersey. So that's the War of the Worlds scare. Now, you did have one in the late 1940s in Quito, Ecuador, that did cause massive panic. Over a dozen people were killed. The radio station where they broadcast the supposed Martian invasion was burned down, and it was a real disaster.
Wow.
That actually happened, and there's been a number of other radio scares involving an adaptation of the War of the Worlds. So it is well worth noting that.
Yeah, and I'm just noting that event in Quito made the New York Times. 20 dead in the Quito riot, 15 held for Martian invasion radio show and panic. So there you go. Amazing. So take us into the 20th century, Robert, and then we'll get back to New Jersey and how we make sense of this going forward, and what our scientists at Rutgers, what I might do further with you guys to.
What really happens with these social panics is what I like to call them. They're usually driven by anxieties, and again, the sighting there in New Jersey by the professor from Rutgers, I think that's a large drone. But in general, all this noise that gets kicked up around these, what happens is, I'll use an example. I wrote a book on the Lake Champlain monster, America's equivalent of the Loch Ness monster, because we lived on Lake Champlain and in Whitehall, New York, when I grew up. And what's interesting is you will go months, sometimes years, without a sighting of the Lake Champlain monster, known as Champ. Then all of a sudden, there'll be a sighting that gets reported in the media, this initial sensational case, and then there'll be a flurry of sightings afterwards.
Right.
And then it dies down. And you might not get many sightings for months or years. And then it happens again. And it happens again. You get these flurries that happen over 1 or 2 weeks, then they die down. And look, the Lake Champlain monster, like Loch Ness, is, according to scientists, most likely, I don't believe it's there, but the most likely theories, if it is there, it's a zoiglodon, a form of primitive whale, or a plesiosaur. Both of these are air-breathing mammals. They have to come up for air every so often. Right. So you should get sightings relatively consistently over time. You don't get that here. Same with Loch Ness. You get an initial sensational case, and then a flurry of reports afterwards. They die down, and that's it. And so what happens with lake monster waves of sightings and UFO sightings and Jersey Devil sightings and Bigfoot sightings and chupacabras is you get typically an initial sensational case. Now people are scanning the woods for the chupacabra. They are scanning the skies.
Right.
Now, ordinarily, most people don't stare at the skies for long periods of time at night. They don't stare at the woods for long periods of time. But now they are. And so now there's this scrutinization that's more than normal, more than typical. And what happens is human perception is very fallible and subject to error. So there's a tendency for people to see what they expect to see. The human mind does not take in information like a video cassette recorder. It interprets information at the same time, right? We are prone to seeing things that aren't there. It's the way that our brains are wired. We are wired to connect the dots and see patterns that don't necessarily exist. But those patterns we see are a projection of our beliefs. And this happens all the time with things like the face on Mars, right?
Right.
And other phenomena. You know, the woman, Maria Rubio in Port Arthur, New Mexico, who in 1977 was cooking a tortilla with a skillet and burned it and thought she saw the face of Jesus. So yeah, we're these waves of sightings, the majority of sightings, some sightings are actually drones without a doubt, but the majority of sightings, I think, are driven by human perceptual fallibility.
So we have here an anomaly. We have two people who've clearly seen an actual drone. Before we get back into the sky with the drones, etc., because you're talking about some biological examples, we have two bird-focused people on the line. I have to bring in the ivory-billed woodpecker, which I've written about quite a bit, and there's a significant resumed debate about its existence or non-existence. And there is the pileated woodpecker, which is very similar. So I don't know if Joanna, you and your husband had tracked this whole issue, but it's
Very much so.
Of course we've tracked it.
Before you go on, the reporting I've done on UFOs and the reporting I've done on the ivory-billed woodpecker, there's a lot of overlap in a weird way.
Well, the thing about the ivory-billed woodpecker is that it started out with a film that they showed at the American Ornithologists Union when we were there to fellows and other people, of which we are.
Right.
And if you looked at that film carefully, there's no way that was an ivory-billed woodpecker. But some reputable people thought it was. And there's a couple of different reasons why it couldn't possibly have been. First of all, the people who were in the boat didn't seem excited at all, as you would if you were, in fact, thought it was an ivory-billed woodpecker. The second thing is the pileated woodpecker is very loud and noisy all the time. That's how we find them. That's how we identify them. So to have such a closely related species that, in fact, no one would hear or has heard for a number of years is really problematic. So that that's the sort of the different thing. But it is something where people wanted to believe that it was alive. I'd like to have it be alive, but there is no
motivated reasoning part is really.
But there is no evidence for it, and that doesn't cloud my perception as a scientist when I see a movie that some people want to be a woodpecker to believe that that's it.
There is also a picture of three birds flying overhead, and if you think they're going to the left, then they're woodpeckers. If you think they're going to the right, they're ducks.
Yes, because the shape.
Yeah, because of
so they've had a lot of sound surveys in the place where the ivory-billed has been reported.
Right.
And the ivory-billed has relatives in the same genus that also do a double knock as their characteristic display.
Right.
And when you're in the territory of one of these woodpeckers in South America,
loud.
they're knocking more than once a minute. you wouldn't miss their presence. So sad to say, I have gone from an optimistic skeptic to a pessimistic skeptic. I think we're not going to find it.
Yeah.
Whether it may exist in Cuba is still uncertain. But
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I'm very much pessimistic. I'd like to think they exist, but
I want to think they exist also, but no evidence that I have seen is compelling.
yeah,
Could I add that?
absolutely. Yeah.
I'm sure there's some Bigfooters out there that may not listen to your podcast, but like, oh, those wood knocks, it must be Bigfoot, right? Because now the Bigfoot community has this belief that, they'll call out and they'll do these knocks and then they hear a knock back. And it's like, it's Bigfoot. It's like, yeah, but they never catch it in those TV shows. The other interesting aspect is you were saying that some of these people, experts were saying, yes, it could be an ivy-billed woodpecker that was being seen. And that's a good point, because as journalists, you can always find someone who believes that people are being abducted by space aliens, somebody with a PhD, right?
Yes.
And John Mack at Harvard used to believe that people were being abducted by space aliens. There are people with PhDs who believe that Bigfoot is out there. However, the majority of the mainstream scientific community, no, the evidence isn't there. And the person is not necessarily a quack, pardon the language with the ornithologist there, but the person's not necessarily a quack, but they have interpreted it differently, and it doesn't make it any more real just because a person has a PhD and says it's so.
Yeah, and I mean, the media environment is impossible. My hair has been catching on fire watching ABC News and CBS News, pulling together reports where they're automatically talking about drones, not in the sense that Joanna and her husband were, but that this massive event is an event and not reported events, and they just jump completely to the and then quoting politicians as expertise is, you see this all the time.
Well, there's clearly the potential. There's clearly the potential for that, but in most of the science things, like the case of the ivory-billed woodpecker, you can get reasonable people together and look at something and figure out what's going on. And the problem with this is that the event we had was so out of the ordinary. I didn't have a camera. I mean, when I go into the field, I normally have, high-powered cameras and things you can take pictures of. Who does that when you go in a hot tub? So my own feeling is that there is a certain percentage of these that are drones, and whether we know what they are or don't know what they are, or whether they are people who have gotten on the bandwagon and are now flying things that they shouldn't be, there are a lot of people who do weird things.
The opportunity for conspiracy lingers over the ivory-billed as well. There were a number of reported ivory-billed sightings, for instance, in the big thicket of East Texas, which are believed to have been deliberately false to interfere with the proposed development of the forest.
Right.
Well, but also it changes money. If you can find a really super endangered species, then you can get a lot of money protected. And unfortunately, that's what's happened with the ivory bill. It was not a fungible budget, and so money to go to protect what the so-called ivory bill sighting was taken away from legitimate endangered species that then didn't have sufficient monies. And so there's a real cost to being wrong and starting a public outcry. Oh, we've got to go protect this ivory-billed woodpecker, when it actually didn't exist, and it took money away from other important conservation efforts.
And in this case, there's some significant ramifications. There are people who've been pointing their lasers at planes flying overhead, which can, the FAA, it's against the law, it's against federal law, and can become a danger to aviation. So it's no one's tried to shoot one down yet, I guess, but I guess we'll see.
I heard on the radio coming home from the office today, I heard Trump had been saying, shoot the things down. And on the way home from the office today, I heard him say the federal government knows what they are and they're not telling us yet.
Right.
I
Exactly.
don't know whether he's been briefed on something that we have not been briefed on. I don't know.
Well, this gets back to Robert, because Robert, part of the dynamic, there's the media and then there's government, and trust is a key issue these days, and trust in institutions. So how do you see this? You've reported on examples going back generations, but we have a media environment now that does seem to hyper intensify the edges of these arguments. So do you feel it's worse than ever, or are we just imagining it's worse than ever when we think about things like this?
I think it's worse than ever. I began my career as a journalist in upstate New York, and it was really mortifying over the past decade to see the way that major media outlets go for clicks and views and sensationalism. I wrote the book on Havana Syndrome with neurologist Bob Bartholomew at UCLA, and how they hyped the Havana Syndrome case when the evidence wasn't there. CBS, NBC, CNN, and I worked in CNN radio, a radio affiliate in Albany, New York in the early 1980s, and have great respect for them. However, there never was brain damage shown in the cohort in Cuba, and they kept reporting that, and it was definitively not true. Again, though, you can find rogue scientists who can support just about any position out there. I like to say that history never repeats itself, but it rhymes. And what we're seeing with the drone scare is the rhyming of history. If you go back around World War I, 1914 to 1918, there were many UFO scares across the United States, particularly New Jersey, Delaware, New Hampshire, involving sightings of mystery airplanes and airships, particularly around military installations. And these caused a great deal of alarm. There are hundreds and hundreds of newspaper articles that have been written on these. And what happens is these scares are driven, they're signs of the times, and they're social barometers of fears. Right now, it's a literal projection, a Rorschach ink blot projection onto the sky of current fears. And I think there are two fears that are driving this, two moral panics. One is the moral panic over migrants and the fear, xenophobia, the fear of foreigners. And it's the Chinese or it's the Iranians. And we had the balloon incident not that long ago. So that lends plausibility to this. However, I think if it's the Chinese or the Iranians, I don't think they're going to have lights and bells and whistles and be going around, letting people know about this.
That's a good point.
And it's also a fear of new technology. And we've had this going for some time now, where in the late 1800s, when the telephone was invented, there were telephone operators who were claiming, large groups of them, that they were getting sick from talking on the telephone because it was this new technology. When ice cubes first came out, people claimed to get sick from them because it was artificially created. When AM radio first came out, people thought it was affecting the weather. Mobile phones, video display terminals causing birth defects. The Wi-Fi, 5G towers, all of these things that are allegedly tied to health issues. So this is there's always concern about the dangers of new technology. In Havana, it was that somebody had developed this new secret weapon, a directed energy device that was zapping people. And so now it's the new technology of drones, which is real. And there's concern over them, and rightly so. There should be concern over them, and that just lends to this. There's all this haze and ambiguity out there as well. You got the nighttime sky, and so you've got your real sightings, like the professor in New Jersey, and then you've got the vast majority of this, which I think is noise. and it's human perception and it's history repeating itself.
The trouble is sometimes they're
And
right.
the goal is to separate the
Sometimes
noise
they're
from
right,
the reality.
as in the case of, the government saying radiation wasn't bad and you didn't need to worry about being close to underground nuclear tests, or sometimes, or the fact that you could swallow, chloride to get rid of COVID. I mean, there are some times when it's difficult. In the long run, it turns out that the fear was real and has a basis. So the difficulty is figuring out which is which.
Yeah, I try to focus
That's
on.
true.
Sorry.
I think that a couple
that's
of
true.
the examples you mentioned of new technologies, don't pass them off as innocuous yet. We don't really have enough data.
Okay,
on
the other thing I would say
like
is
these, for example.
the fact that, look, conspiracy theories, the fact that there actually are real conspiracies,
Yes,
the fact
Right.
that there are sometimes real
That's right.
health issues with new technology only drives the plausibility.
That's right. That's
Yep.
right. That's right.
And,
So-
and again,
one of
the
the
social
things
media.
that we do, one of the things that we do, is investigate health outbreaks, and occasionally some of these health outbreaks are clearly examples of what used to be called mass hysteria.
But not all.
A whole bunch of kids going blind in the same dormitory, for example.
Right.
So,
Yep.
when you investigate, it's very hard to talk.
I always say when you look at, I always say when there are alleged reports of mass hysteria, assume it's real, like there's some physical cause, and you need to immediately investigate that and rule that out.
Your signal is
Because we owe it to the people, the victims, to look at that first and then eliminate it. Just like a doctor, it's like, oh, you have a headache. Okay, well, let's eliminate brain tumor and work from there.
right. Well, and you dug in deep on some of the medical situations, the hiccuping, hysteria in Salem, I believe, and then this. I'm just showing another one you worked on, the clown. I think you were involved with the. This is more of a perceptual one, the clown outbreak.
The clown outbreak, and look, with the hiccuping, the Massachusetts Department of Public Health covered that up. And I found out that they had concluded it was mass psychogenic illness through the Freedom of Information Act. And, there's a stigma attached to mass psychogenic illness. And so they really didn't want to come out and say that. And they thought it could exacerbate the case initially. But later I raked them over the coals, because when you're dealing with health, at least after the outbreak had died down, they should have come out and said that. When you talk about the clown scare, that's an interesting one, because, why do so many people have a fear of clowns or feel uneasy about clowns? And it's because 80% of communication is nonverbal. And so clowns putting on the makeup or a mask, it's difficult to read people, and it makes people feel very uneasy.
So, and again, from what I understand of that time, people were feeding. It became kind of a self-perpetuating cycle too, where people were dressing up more as clowns, etc.
And that feeds into the drone scare. Without a doubt, I think that there are opportunistic people out there who get a thrill from now flying drones and watching the TV and seeing if they're on, or and that's part of the driver once this started and once people started to scrutinize the skies.
Right. And we haven't really talked through the UFO issue, how it's related, but there too you have not just motivated reasoning, meaning wishful thinking, but actual strategic. Power bases are changing. Funding is changing, as we heard earlier. Even with the ivory-billed woodpecker, there's subsets of people within the Pentagon who benefit from having the inquiry and formal reports and the like. So there's these layers of motivation that can be in there as well. Well, I'm glad you're out there trying to disentangle these things. I want to show one last little snippet. There's other people working really hard to doing something really hard, which is once these issues snowball, it's a very hard thing. You don't just roll the snowball back. But Matthew Capucci is a meteorologist who's very active on social media, and he's put his meteorological and now analytical skills, also very adept at tracking aviation, and he's been on Instagram and here and there. So let's hear from him.
A social phenomenon called mass hysteria is happening in New Jersey. It's tied to all the drone and the UFO reports. Except all the videos on TV and social media are actually of ordinary passenger aircraft. They even have the red and green wingtip lights, for crying out loud. Northern New Jersey is some of the busiest commercial airspace in the world. Even the TV news media is airing ordinary airplane videos and perpetuating the hysteria. The airplanes are just following normal flight paths as they land at LaGuardia, Newark, and JFK. Mass hysteria begins when people are told to notice something ordinary that they otherwise typically overlook, but then they're given an extraordinary or outlandish explanation. In this case, they're noticing airplanes, but they're told they're drones. Then more people call in false drone reports. Then the police say, we're getting drone reports. Then the public says, aha, the police said so, there are drones. And then the hysteria begins. A similar thing actually happened in Seattle back in April of 1954. People were told to investigate if their windshield was pitted. Most of them obviously were, but folks had never noticed. Then somehow panic spread that bomb testing or sand flea infestations had caused the natural wear and tear on people's cars. Mass panic is able to give ideas a life of their own.
So is there anything there that's inconsistent with your understanding of how these
No,
things
the famous 1954 Seattle windshield pitting epidemic, that's exactly right. And, it's these scares are driven by an initial sensational report that gets publicized, and now people start to over-scrutinize their environment as they look for evidence to confirm or deny its existence.
Right.
And it happens with Bigfoot, it happens with lake monsters, and it happens with unidentified flying objects. People say, oh, they're not unidentified flying objects, they're drones. Well, they're unidentified flying objects. If you knew what they were, then they would be identified flying objects. And so this pattern keeps occurring over and over again. And the interesting thing to me is we keep getting fooled over and over again. And it's just part of the human condition. And look, your podcast is on sustainability. I would argue when we're talking about social delusions, the greatest social delusion of all is that global warming is a hoax. And that everything we're talking about right now, drones, and it's inconsequential to the future of humanity. And that depends on bringing down the temperature of the earth so we have a planet in the future. And that is the ultimate concern that I have, because what use are drones if you don't have a planet to fly them on? And so I think you having a podcast on this topic, which is the most important topic in the world, bar none, at the present time. There's nothing more important because it's the future of humanity that's at stake.
Well, and as I say, though, I guarantee you we won't be addressing the climate change problem adequately if we don't have the social climate and the information climate under better managed. And management isn't necessarily the right word. If we, as consumers of information or as producers of reports like journalists, there's a lot of work to be done to avoid feeding fires of this sort and facilitating access to information that can help people change their lives for the better, including manage the climate system. So I'm really glad we could have this conversation today. And I was thrilled to have the two scientists from Rutgers come on. I am going to try to put them in touch with Mick West and some of the more forensic folks. And again, it's great to have Robert Bartholomew on from Auckland, New Zealand, to talk about drones and UFOs. And we didn't get to the pet eating, but that was another form of hysteria. You know, I haven't seen any reporters go back to Springfield, Ohio, and say, "Oh, how are things there?" And you know, that's part of the duty of journalists as well, is to.
There was a journalist from the Washington Post that interviewed me recently. She actually drove there. She called me from there and actually did a follow-up story. But that's so true. You know, once the drone scare drops out of the news, which it will eventually, like the Chinese balloon episode, it just kind of drops. And then it's gone, right, for the most part. And then there's some new bright, shiny object that gets latched onto.
Right.
And it's just the nature of the media.
It is, unfortunately. And I work as hard as I can to shift practices toward talking to folks like you. So thanks again for coming on from New Zealand. And anyone watching this, you can share it when we're done. It gets archived right away. And this is Sustain What? My effort to navigate complexity and consequence and come out the other end with a little bit of progress. This is Andy Revkin. And if you're in New Jersey or anywhere and you see you have a credible encounter with one of these phenomena, and especially if you get it on film or like, let somebody know. And take, as Mick West said, location, date, and all that stuff. Get the details. Thanks again. Have a good day. Have a good night. And
thank you.